Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Rideout, and I'm going to be going over our Assessments Part 1 presentation with you guys today. Following Assessments Part 1, you're going to be going into Part 2. So what Part 1 is really going to do for us is kind of give us some background knowledge, and it's going to give us some vocabulary that we can then take and dive a little bit deeper into in our second Assessments presentation with you guys. So looking at some of the things that we're going to talk about today, just to kind of give us a little bit of a roadmap and what to expect, we're going to be looking at criterion and norm reference tests. What are these? What do these mean? How are they assessed? How do we get the scores? We're going to look into all of that. We're also going to take a look at a bell curve. And then we're going to interpret some scores using our bell curve. So how do the scores that we get from these norm reference tests then get plotted onto our bell curve, and then how do we as teachers interpret what those numbers mean? So first off, we have our criterion reference tests. And as educators, we actually give criterion reference tests all the time. So these are going to be our spelling test, our math test, our social studies test. Criterion are the skills that you taught that you want the kids to know, and now you're going to test those criteria. So it shows us, has a child mastered this really specific skill? And educators, we create our own criterion reference tests all the time in our classrooms. And we're really going to refer to these as our informal assessments because they haven't been through the rigorous norming process with a large population of people. So these criterion reference tests haven't been statistically analyzed, and you wouldn't take your classroom spelling test and go through a rigorous statistical analysis like you would with formal assessments or formal testing. So instead, what you do with criterion reference is you measure students' performance on specific areas of knowledge from the curriculum. You want to see, here's what they're expected to know, how did they do, and now how do I need to adjust my instruction based on our students' needs? So a criterion reference test, we actually have a really simple formula that we can use. We gauge our students' level of mastery by taking the number correct. We're going to divide it by the number provided or presented, and this is going to give us a percentage. So, for example, let's say this past week I gave a spelling test. I'm trying to measure my students' performance on very specific areas of knowledge from the curricula, and in this case, I want to test it on a specific spelling skill. So this is Katie. And I want to see how well is she doing with what she's expected to know, and then do I need to adjust my instruction based on her needs and her level of mastery? So we can see here that the test consisted of 10 words, and Katie got 9 of those words correct. So if I follow my simple formula from above, I can see that I'm going to divide my number correct, that would be 9, by the number presented in the assessment, 10, and this is going to give Katie a score of 90%. So now this score tells me that she's doing just fine, and she really isn't having that much difficulty mastering this specific skill in spelling that I assessed. In fact, from her score, I see that she's probably ready to move on to the next skill in spelling. But we can see that Billy in this little picture, well, he's struggling a little bit. So if we take a look at his spelling test score, we see that he was able to spell 6 out of 10 correctly. So for Billy, if we follow this formula, we would take our 6, we would divide it by 10, and that's going to give him a score of 60%. So now this is an indicator to me, all right, I need to adjust my instruction for Billy because of his low level of mastery on this spelling test. So our criterion reference are really going to be used in our classrooms quite often. So what we can do is we can look at criterion reference test here, and we can see that it's only comparing a student's knowledge and skills against the mastery of a set of specific skills or criteria. In this type of test, we really see that we're only comparing the scores, or I'm only looking at an individual student. So Katie's score on her spelling test of 90% has nothing to do and doesn't affect Billy's score of 60%. I'm just looking at Katie. But when I go to norm reference test, this is going to establish a child's skill level. So here's our child. But now I'm going to compare it with others who are of the same age, or I can even go with peers who are in the same grade. Now this is going to be a much larger sample, so we would be using norm reference tests to establish a child's skill level with others of the same age or grade, but this time it's not just going to be just with her grade. It could be within an entire school. It could even be within an entire state, or even as large as a national sample. Because this sample is so large, they're going to be based on some form of broad national standards. So earlier with our criterion reference, I was basing that right off of our local curricula. Well, now with norm reference tests, that's going to be much broader, and that's not going to be on local curricula anymore, but instead on a broad national standard. Now, in order to calculate the average for norm reference test, what test designers do is they take the results of everyone who's taken the test, and then they analyze them to calculate what would be the average. Now remember, norm references are going to be a larger population of people, so they would be gathering and analyzing the results of thousands of people to calculate this average. And unlike our criterion reference test, a norm reference test doesn't really seek to enforce any expectation of what test takers should know or even what they should be able to do. Instead, what they do is they measure the test taker's current level, and then they compare it to the test taker, or they compare the test taker's level to those of their peers. Now, norm reference tests generate scores by a sampling. So they're not going to get a thorough inventory of what a child knows. So the test designers have carefully crafted test questions that are going to illuminate performance differences between our high and low achievers. What they do is they assess a generalized sample of a specific skill. So as we can see here, they provide a sample of nonsense words. As the student reads the words, they progressively get more difficult. And while we can see, okay, this sample doesn't include every CVC word, but it is going to provide the assessor an idea of the ability level of that test taker or that student. So we would want to use informal assessments, or our criterion reference tests, like our spelling test and our math test, to really understand where our students are breaking down individually. So again, I can go back and I can compare. Katie individually is doing just fine with that skill. She got a 90%, but Billy, on an individual level, he's struggling. But with norm reference test, this is really just going to give the assessor an idea of where the student is in comparison to where their peers are or where they're expected to perform. And it's really important to mention that test takers can't fail a normed reference test. So as each test taker receives a score that compares the individuals to others that have taken the test. So you can, as we know, because we give our criterion reference test in our classrooms, they can fail a criterion reference test, but they cannot fail a norm reference test because all they're doing is comparing the scores to others who have taken the test. So here's our bell curve. And a bell curve is what's going to make sense of all the scores that are generated from a norm reference test. So after a student takes a norm reference test or a standardized test, it's going to spew out scores for us, and this bell curve is going to make sense of those scores that we are given. So it's a distribution of performance among people. So if you plotted scores earned by everyone who took the test, those scores are going to fall along a distribution line. And that distribution line makes this bell-shaped curve. Now we can see that the curve is highest at the top where it says average, because that's where most people perform, is within that average range. And we can even see that that average range, or the people wearing orange, that makes up a large area of our bell curve. And those people that score in the lower and higher areas, or our blue and our green, they don't make up as much. Now, the shape of the bell curve, it really reflects the fact that there are more average events, more average characteristics than extreme ones. So we know this to be true much more than just academics. So if we were to think about, the weather, there's much more average temperatures than there are extreme ones. Or if we think about athletes, there's much more average athletes than exceptional ones. So when we think about skills, there's many more individuals with average skills than with an exceptional expertise, or the opposite, an exceptional dysfunction. So what this bell curve allows us to do is it allows us to use a common language and scale to discuss how students are faring in relation to their peers. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start looking at how we can interpret those test scores that we receive or that we might see when we look at norm reference test results. So I know I've personally gotten a piece of paper before about a student and there's just numbers all over it, and that's what we're going to look at now. What do we do with those numbers that we're given? So on the bottom of this bell curve, you're going to see that the numbers that we have listed from 60 to 140 are referred to as standard scores. Now our standard scores, really they can span from 40 to 160, but our curve that I have here is just going to go from 60 to 140 because people rarely get above that 140 or rarely below that 60 level. Now, if you look at the very middle, you're going to see 100, and this is going to mark our mean, or the exact middle of average. So our standard scores are a statistic that tells us where a person's performance falls in relation to this average, or to this mean of 100. So if I have a standard score, and my yellow line, you can see that just jumped in, fell right at a standard score of 90. All this is doing is this is allowing us to see where my performance falls in relation to our mean and our average of 100. Now, this can sometimes, or standard scores can sometimes be a little tricky to explain to parents, because if a child got a standard score of 100, these parents might think, that's great, my child got 100. In their eyes, 100 is perfect. It's as high as you can go. But with standard scores, you would really have to explain 100 is really just average. It's not necessarily 100%. All standardized tests are going to use the same scale. So it's important that we know how to interpret what these numbers mean when they're generated and then when they're given to you. And most of our educational and our psychological testing actually use standard scores. So for any normed test, what we're able to do is we can actually look at scores across tests and then compare them to each other and see if there's any relationships or correlations between them. And that's why norm tests are so important to understand, because it really helps us compare one test to another, and it also gives us this common language that we can use. So thinking back to our first bell curve that we looked at with all of our little people, our blue people and our orange people and our green people, we know that the people who are wearing orange made up the majority of our bell curve. And these people were considered to be within the average range. So what we really want to do, though, is we want to associate numbers to our average range. So we can see that looking at our standard scores, our range between a standard score of 90 and a standard score of 110, that's going to be our average range. So if we're given a document that has a list of generated scores from a norm test, and let's say you saw that your student's listening comprehension was a standard score of 105. Well, 105 is right within this average range. So we can see 105, great, their listening comprehension is in the average range. Now you might hear at other times that the average range can actually go from 85 to 115, but 90 to 110 is also commonly recognized as being within average. All right, so we're going to look a little bit more at standard scores later, but right now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to percentiles. So with our standard scores, we really measured a child's skill in relation to our mean, or that average point of 100, right in the middle. Where does their score fall in relation to that mean of 100? But with percentiles, we're not going to do that. So we are not going to measure a child's skill with respect to the mean, but rather we're going to show the percentage of children who earned that given score. So we can see that our range for percentiles on the bottom of our bell curve really ranges anywhere from about 1 to 99. And many people actually consider percentiles to be one of the easiest to understand. So let's take a look at an example. So let's say we have a third grader. A third grade student takes a normed reference test, and they earn a 65th or 65%, 65th percentile rank. Basically, what this means is that this child, this third grader, scored better than or equal to 65% of all the third graders within this norming sample. And remember, the test designers for norm reference test are assessing thousands of people. So this can be at the school level, at the state level, at the national level, against age or grade. So what we can see is, okay, this third grader got a 65th percentile. And we can see that a 65% on our bell curve, this really is in the higher range of average. So this score would be quite satisfactory. They did better than or equal to 65% of third graders on this skill. Now, what we don't want to do is we don't want to confuse it with 65% mastery. So thinking back to Billy and his spelling test, that was our criterion reference test. We were assessing a very specific criterion. We were just looking at Billy. He received a 60%. He didn't do better than 60% of his peers because, again, that little spelling test wasn't normed reference. It wasn't statistically analyzed. That was a criterion reference informal assessment where we were just comparing Billy's score to Billy's. So if you got a 65% on a criterion reference test, that's showing that you probably didn't quite master that specific set of criteria. But if you get a 65th percentile on a norm reference test, that's pretty good. So now you can see on the bottom of our bell curve that I've gone ahead and added both scores in that I talked about. So we have our standard scores and we have our percentile scores. And I want to take a closer look at our average range. So for our standard scores, we know that average is considered to be from 90 to 110. But if we go down now to our percentiles, those standard scores, so that standard score of 90 really lines up with the 25th percentile, and that standard score of 110 lines up with the 75th percentile. So let's go back to that standard score of 90. While yes, that is within my average range, because as I said, if I have a standard score between 90 and 110, that's considered average. Well, that actually puts me at the 25th percentile. So I got a standard score of 90, but my percentile on my bell curve shows that I'm in the 25th percentile, meaning I only did better than 25% of my peers. Or we could even look at it as I did less than 75% of my peers. So if we looked at that descriptive language, we can see, difficult, manageable, very difficult, extremely difficult. The further I go from the mean, the harder things are going to be for me. So looking at my standard score of 90, although I'm in the average range, if I look at that descriptive language, I'm right at the cusp of school being very difficult for me. Yes, I'm an average, but things might not be coming to me quite so easily. And the further I go, the further I go from the mean, the more I'm going to struggle. So the average range can really be deceptive because it is so broad. So it basically goes, our average range basically goes from very difficult to easy. And that's a large range for students to be in. So let's say I got a standard score of 85. Remember, our standard scores are always going to be in comparison to that mean. So my mean of 100, you can see that I'm starting to go further away from that to the left. So school is becoming very difficult for me. So with my standard score of 85, that would probably put me in the, let's say 16th, 17th percentile. So that means I'm only performing better than or as good as 16 to 17% of my peers. And if we explore further to the left, let's say I got a standard score of 70, which means I'm at the 2nd percentile. Well, school's now extremely difficult and it's almost impossible. And if we think about it from the percentile level, this student or this score shows that you only did better than or as well as 2% of the people who took the test. All right, so let's go now though to the right side of our mean point, our average. So we've got our mean of 100 and now I've got a score of 105. So now that I'm going to the right of the mean, things in school are going to be a little easier for me. And if I went even further, I can see with my descriptive language, I've got a standard score of 125. Things are very easy for me. And you can see in my percentiles, my standard score of 125 is going to be the same as about, let's say, 94, 95%. So I'm doing better than, or yeah, I can say I'm doing as well as or better than 95% of my peers. All right, so looking ahead, now that you've watched assessment part 1, you are going to go on to watch assessment part 2. So assessment part 1, again, just kind of gave you some background knowledge, it gave you some vocabulary, because assessment part 2 is going to dive deeper. It's going to go into how screening for dyslexia takes place. We're going to look at what assessments we use for our students with dyslexia. And we're going to take a closer look into what a typical dyslexic student score might look like when we do plot it on this bell curve. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us.